According to the UNESCO World Heritage Center, the world's most ancient, deliberately prepared mummies do not lie in the shadow of the pyramids. They are not the gilded pharaohs of Egypt. To find them, you must travel to the driest non-polar desert on Earth, the Atacama of northern Chile, and go back in time, not 3,000 years, but 7. Here, along a desolate coastline where the sun-scorched land meets the cold Pacific, a simple fishing culture known as the Chinchorro began preserving their dead around 5050 BCE. This practice predates the first Egyptian mummies by 2 full millennia. This fact alone presents a profound historical anomaly. The Egyptians who developed mummification were part of a powerful, state-level society. They had agriculture, writing, monumental architecture, and a complex social hierarchy. Their preservation of the dead was an elite affair, a technological and spiritual luxury reserved for pharaohs and the nobility, designed to secure their passage to the afterlife. The Chinchorro had none of this. They were a pre-ceramic maritime hunter-gatherer society. They built no pyramids, forged no metal, and left behind no written language to explain their actions. They lived in small communities, subsisting on the immense bounty of the Pacific Ocean. Yet, these seemingly simple people developed a mummification technology that was, in some respects, more complex and far more intimate than that of the Egyptians. And unlike in Egypt, it was not for the elite. It was for everyone. Men, women, children, infants, and even fetuses were granted this intricate passage beyond death. It was a deeply egalitarian tradition, a fundamental part of their social fabric that endured for over 3,500 years. For a century, since their scientific discovery by German archaeologist Max Uhle in 1917, the consensus has been that this was a sophisticated form of ancestor worship, a complex religious expression from a culture we barely understand. We see it as a spiritual choice, an effort to keep the physical forms of their loved ones present, to maintain a lineage of visible, tangible bodies. This is the story told in museums and textbooks. But what if this interpretation, while comforting, is fundamentally incomplete? What if the world's first mummification was not an act of spiritual aspiration, but a desperate act of survival? What if this was not a death cult, but a public health crisis, codified in the bodies of their own children? To grasp the scale of this paradox, we must look closer at the mummies themselves. The earliest and most elaborate style, known as the black mummy technique, was not preservation. It was a complete deconstruction and artistic recreation of the human form. Chinchorro artisans would begin by painstakingly removing the skin and flesh from the deceased. The brain and internal organs were extracted, often through the head. What remained was a naked, disarticulated skeleton. This is where the true anomaly begins. Using local reeds, sticks, and grasses, they would systematically lash the skeleton back together, reinforcing the spine and limbs, giving the fragile bones a new, durable interior scaffolding. They were rebuilding the body from the inside out. Then, using gray clay and ash, they would sculpt the muscles and viscera back onto this reinforced frame, meticulously recreating the person's original volume and shape. The original, desiccated skin was then carefully reapplied, sometimes in small pieces like a mosaic. If the original skin was insufficient, they would substitute it with sea lion or pelican skin. A wig of human hair was attached to the head, and the face was covered with a clay mask, often sculpted with an open mouth and eyes. Finally, the entire reconstructed body was painted with a lustrous black manganese. Consider the implications. This society possessed no metal tools, relying only on implements of stone, bone, and shell. They had no system of writing to transmit this highly specialized anatomical knowledge from one generation to the next. They were a mobile people focused on the immediate demands of hunting and gathering. Yet, they demonstrated a practical understanding of human anatomy, of the skeleton, musculature, and internal cavities. That is difficult to explain. This was not a simple act of wrapping a body. It was a feat of reverse engineering. The procedure was so complex, so precise, that it has been compared to a form of pre-scientific surgery. This level of technical sophistication is a profound challenge to our understanding of the capabilities of pre-agricultural societies. But the technological paradox is eclipsed by a far more disturbing question. This intricate, time-consuming process was not reserved for great leaders or warriors. It was egalitarian, and it was applied with the most heartbreaking frequency to the most vulnerable, to children, to infants, and even to miscarried and stillborn fetuses. The smallest members of their community received the most elaborate treatments. Imagine for a moment the immense emotional weight of performing this act. A mother and father, deconstructing and then lovingly rebuilding the tiny form of their lost child over weeks, transforming a devastating loss into a permanent effigy. A grief codified in dust. This pattern, repeated over millennia, forces us to look beyond the paradigm of ancestor worship. Such a widespread, desperate focus on the young suggests a community in the grip of a terrible, recurring trauma. It suggests that death was not a normal, predictable part of their life cycle, but a constant, predatory presence. Something was silently devastating the Chinchorro, targeting their lineage at its very source. So we are left with two deeply unsettling questions. How did a culture without writing or metallurgy acquire the sophisticated knowledge to essentially rebuild a human body from its constituent parts? And what invisible enemy was stalking this coastal paradise, compelling them to develop this macabre art form in response to an epidemic of death among their children? Chinchorro inhabited a landscape of profound contradiction. To the east, the absolute sterility of the Atacama. To the west, the staggering biomass of the Pacific Ocean, sustained by the cold Humboldt Current. This ocean was their larder, their entire world. But to survive, they needed fresh water. This water flowed down from the Andes in a few precious rivers, carving green veins through the desolate brown. For millennia, these rivers were a gift, the essential element that made life possible. This water was trusted implicitly. For a century, archaeology treated the Chinchorro's technical skill and their high infant mortality rate as separate cultural and biological puzzles. But the truth could not be unearthed with a trowel. The evidence was not in the arrangement of graves or the design of their tools. It was microscopic, encoded into the very keratin and collagen of the dead. The mystery required a modern forensic science, one that could detect the chemical ghosts of the past, paleotoxicology. Led by bioarchaeologist Bernardo Arriaza, researchers began to analyze hair meticulously preserved on the mummies for 7,000 years. Hair acts as a permanent biological archive, trapping a chemical record of everything an individual ingests over time. Like the rings of a tree, each millimeter of hair growth locks in a chemical snapshot of the body's internal environment, providing a timeline of exposure. When the results came back, they provided the first clue to the underlying tragedy. The hair of Chinchorro men, women, and especially their children was saturated with arsenic. We are not speaking of trace environmental exposure. The analysis, published in journals like the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, revealed concentrations that are, by modern standards, lethally toxic. With this discovery, the entire paradigm shifted. The two great anomalies, the macabre artistry and the endless procession of dead infants, were no longer separate phenomena. They converged into a single, horrifying narrative. The Chinchorro were not simply a culture obsessed with their ancestors. They were a people systematically and unknowingly being poisoned. The invisible enemy wasn't a spirit or a disease. It was hidden in plain sight, in the very water that quenched their thirst. The investigation now had its murder weapon. But a final, critical question remained. Where was it coming from? The search for the arsenic's origin led scientists away from the mummies and towards the landscape itself. The investigation turned to hydrology and geology, tracing the rivers that sustained the Chinchorro back to their sources high in the Andes Mountains. There, they found the answer. The volcanic geology of the Andes naturally leaches heavy metals, including vast quantities of arsenic into the groundwater. As rivers like the Camarones flow towards the Pacific, they carry this dissolved poison with them. Analysis of these water sources, detailed in the Journal of Archaeological Science, revealed a staggering truth. The water the Chinchorro drank every day contained arsenic levels over 100 times the modern safe limit established by the World Health Organization. 100 times. To put that number in perspective, consuming that level of arsenic today would trigger immediate public health emergencies and the deployment of emergency water supplies. For the Chinchorro, it was simply water. This condition has a clinical name, chronic arsenicosis. It is not a swift poison that kills in hours. It is a slow, insidious erosion of the body. It manifests in painful skin lesions, skin hardening into cracked plaques, peripheral neuropathy that feels like a fire in the nerves, cardiovascular diseases, and various forms of cancer. The paleopathological evidence, published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, corroborates this diagnosis, showing skeletal markers consistent with a population under severe, long-term physiological stress. But arsenic reserves its most cruel effects for the unborn and the newly born. As a potent teratogen, it attacks developing cells, making it exceptionally toxic to fetuses and infants. For Chinchorro women, pregnancy would have been a terrifying ordeal, frequently ending in spontaneous abortion, stillbirth, or the birth of a child who would not survive its first year. The constant presence of mummified infants and fetuses was no longer a cultural choice. It was the direct, archaeological signature of this environmental tragedy. They were trying to hold on to the children their world would not let them keep. Here, the full horror of their situation becomes clear. The enemy was invisible, tasteless, and odorless. It was inseparable from the water they needed to survive. Every sip of water that sustained a mother's life was simultaneously poisoning the child in her womb. Every generation was weaker than the last. This was not a war or a famine. It was a silent, multi-generational epidemic, a biological siege from which there was no escape. The sheer number of infant mummies is the statistical record of this devastation. A grief codified in dust. Faced with this unending loss, with their lineage dissolving before their eyes, what does a community do? When the natural order is inverted, when children die more often than their elders, and the body of a loved one, left to the elements, decomposes with unnatural speed, how does a culture respond? This was not a sudden cataclysm. It began as a quiet, gnawing sorrow, a series of isolated tragedies that slowly, over generations, coalesced into a terrifying pattern. Imagine the earliest Chinchorro, living in what must have felt like a paradise. The Pacific, teeming with fish and sea lions, was a source of infinite abundance. The rivers, flowing from the Andes, were the arteries of life in a desiccated world. In the hyper-arid climate of the Atacama, a body left in the sand would naturally desiccate, a simple, accidental form of preservation. For a time, this was enough. The world, though harsh, followed an understandable order. But the pattern began to emerge. A pregnancy would end without reason. A newborn, seemingly healthy, would wither and fade. A toddler would be seized by a sickness that left the elders baffled. At first, these were the random cruelties of existence. But soon, the losses became too frequent, the grief too constant. The natural desiccation of the desert was no longer a comfort. It was a reminder of their fragility. The bodies of their children, even when dried by the sun, would eventually succumb to scavengers and the elements, their tiny forms returning to dust too quickly. The community's memory of them was fading, erased by the wind. This slow, agonizing dissolution of their lineage was the seed of a radical idea. They needed a way to make their lost children permanent. This is how the technological paradox resolves itself. Chinchorro's sophisticated anatomical knowledge was not born from detached scientific curiosity. It was learned on the front lines of grief. The first attempts were likely simple, perhaps covering a small body in clay to protect it from the elements. But the clay would crack, and the body within would still decay. The problem was internal. This realization must have been a terrifying threshold to cross. To stop the decay, they had to go inside the body. The first incision was not an act of scientific inquiry. It was an act of desperate love. A parent, determined to save their child from oblivion, making a cut to remove the organs that were the source of decomposition. Through this process, repeated with heartbreaking frequency, they learned. Each loss became a lesson in anatomy. They discovered the skeletal framework, the way muscles attach to bone, the empty spaces left behind by organs. They learned how to reinforce a spine with a stick, how to lash limbs together with reeds, how to pack the empty thoracic cavity with grass to restore its form. This was not a formal education, transmitted through scrolls or lectures. It was a grim apprenticeship with death itself. The knowledge was passed from one grieving family to another, a set of techniques refined over centuries of sorrow. As bioarchaeologist Bernardo Ariaza's research suggests, this was not art for art's sake. It was a necessary social and emotional technology, engineered to navigate a crisis that was tearing their world apart. Their mastery was not a sign of intellectual leisure, but of unimaginable, relentless suffering. The landscape they had trusted turned against them. The water, their source of life, became a curse they could not comprehend. Imagine the psychological terror. Every joyous event, a marriage, a pregnancy, was now shadowed by the near certainty of loss. The natural order was inverted. The elders were burying the young. The community was trapped in a cycle of hope and devastation. This constant, pervasive grief would have threatened the very fabric of their society. Culture cannot survive under such a sustained emotional assault. It fractures. It loses its will to continue. The arsenicosis was not just killing their bodies. It was eroding their reality. When the world no longer makes sense, when the fundamental rules of life and death are broken, a people must create a new system of meaning to survive. They must impose their own order on the chaos. The Chinchorro were faced with a choice: descend into a collective despair from which they would never recover, or engineer a new way of being, a new relationship with life, death, and the dead themselves. They chose to fight back, not with weapons, but with art, with ritual, with a defiant act of creation in the face of annihilation. The black mummy technique was the culmination of this fight. It was a system, a codified process that transformed the horror of a child's death into a communal act of remembrance and control. The procedure was a ritual of reversal. Death deconstructed the body, they would reconstruct it. The poison ravaged their children from the inside out. They would rebuild them from the inside out. They took the broken, fragile remains and made them solid, permanent, and beautiful. They covered the clay masks with black manganese, a mineral that gave the effigies a lustrous, otherworldly sheen. They were not just preserving bodies. They were creating eternal vessels for the spirits of their lost children, tangible ancestors that could be held, cared for, and seen. They had found a way to manage the grief, to give it form and function. They had invented a powerful tool to keep their social world from collapsing. But in creating these permanent, physical effigies of their dead, they had unknowingly triggered a much deeper social revolution. For once a family had spent weeks lovingly rebuilding their child, they could not bring themselves to simply bury their creation. And if you do not bury the dead, what then do you do with them? The archaeological evidence is unequivocal. The Chinchorro did not bury their creations. Not at first. Having invested weeks of meticulous, emotional labor into rebuilding their loved ones, entombing them in the earth would have been an unthinkable finality. Instead, they did something that fundamentally altered the course of their culture. They lived with their dead. Analysis by researchers like Bernardo Arriaza shows that these mummies were not static objects destined for a tomb. They bear the marks of a long and active social life. They were repaired, their limbs relashed, their clay masks and bodies repainted, sometimes multiple times over decades. They were curated. This indicates they were handled, moved, and displayed. Imagine a small coastal encampment. The living move among the effigies of their parents, their grandparents, and the heartbreakingly small forms of the children they never had a chance to know. The dead were not gone. They were simply quiet. They were present at meals, propped up during communal rituals, and passed down from one generation to the next. This is the paradigm shift. The mummification was not the end goal. It was the beginning of a radical new social contract. The Chinchorro had, out of necessity, engineered a system we might call a tangible lineage. In most cultures, ancestry is an abstract concept, a story told, a name recited. For the Chinchorro, it became a physical, undeniable presence. Your lineage was not a memory. It was a collection of bodies you cared for, a silent council that anchored your identity in the world. This system provided the solution to the arsenic crisis, but not in a way we would recognize. It did not cure the poisoning, but it healed the social fabric that the poisoning was tearing apart. When a community is losing its children faster than it can replace them, its sense of a future is obliterated. Hope itself becomes a liability. The tangible lineage was a brilliant, if tragic, countermeasure. By transforming the lost child into a permanent physical ancestor, the loss was not erased, but integrated. The lineage, though biologically severed, was socially maintained. The family did not shrink. It grew to include both the living and the dead. This is the full answer to the central mystery. The world's first mummification was not born from a complex cosmology of the afterlife. It was a psychosocial adaptation to an environmental catastrophe. The egalitarian nature of the practice, a puzzle for so long, now makes perfect sense. In a community fighting for its very survival, every single person mattered. Every birth was a victory, every death a devastating blow to the collective. Therefore, every individual, man, woman, child, and fetus, was granted this permanence. There were no elites because the crisis was universal. Their survival was not dependent on a king, but on the strength of their kinship bonds, bonds they now rendered unbreakable. Over the 500-year history of the practice, we see this system evolving. The technically demanding black mummies eventually gave way to the simpler red mummy technique, where organs were removed through small incisions and the body was dried and filled before being painted with red ochre. This shift likely represents a culture that had institutionalized the practice. The initial, frantic need to deconstruct and rebuild, a response to the horror of decomposition, had been replaced by a more stable, streamlined ritual. The core principle, however, remained: the dead stay with us. It is here that the traditional interpretation of ancestor worship is not so much wrong as it is incomplete. It mistakes the consequence for the cause. Of course, the Chinchorro revered these figures. If you were raised in a world where your great-grandmother's effigy sits in the corner of your family's dwelling, where you are taught to maintain her form as a sacred duty, you would develop a profound spiritual connection to her. The worship was not the initial impetus for mummification. It was the inevitable, emergent result of living alongside your physical ancestors for centuries. The ritual was born from grief, but it matured into a religion. The mummies became more than effigies. They were the ultimate source of social identity and stability. They were title deeds to territory, physical proof of a family's right to a particular stretch of coastline. They were historical archives, the embodiment of a lineage stretching back into deep time. In a world without writing, these bodies were the text. They were a library of kinship. The arsenic never went away. For millennia, the Chinchorro continued to drink the poisoned water, and for millennia, they continued to suffer and die from it. But their social technology, born from that suffering, allowed them to endure. They had faced an invisible, implacable enemy and responded by refusing to let it erase them. They answered the biological dissolution of their community with an act of profound social and artistic creation. This was their triumph and their tragedy, a story of resilience written not in stone but in the meticulously crafted bodies of their own people. It was, in the end, a grief codified in dust. And so, the investigation concludes. The central mystery that has persisted for a century, why a simple fishing culture created the world's first mummies, is resolved. The answer is not a testament to a precocious spiritual insight or a sudden flourishing of artistic expression for its own sake. The truth, unearthed by paleotoxicology, is far more visceral and unsettling. The entire elaborate tapestry of Chinchorro mortuary practice was a social technology, invented to manage the unbearable grief of a community being slowly erased by a poisoned environment. Their art was an antidote to despair. Their rituals were a form of psychological survival. This conclusion forces us to confront a profound and uncomfortable paradigm shift. The traditional archaeological narrative often frames complex ritual as a top-down phenomenon, a product of spiritual revelation, cosmological belief, or the consolidation of elite power. It presupposes a degree of stability and surplus, the cognitive space for a culture to look up at the heavens and contemplate the abstract. The Chinchorro narrative inverts this entirely. Here, one of humanity's most enduring ritual traditions was not born from looking up at the stars, but from looking down at the graves of their own children. It was a bottom-up response, an emergent property of collective trauma. It suggests that the origins of what we call religion or spirituality may lie not in moments of divine inspiration, but in the desperate human need to impose order on a world of chemical and biological chaos. This is the polemic at the heart of the Chinchorro story. It challenges the very foundations of how we interpret the past. We are left in a state of deep ambiguity. We see the products of their grief, the haunting, serene faces of the black mummies, and we recognize them as masterpieces of prehistoric art. We admire their resilience, their ingenuity, their profound communal love that drove them to defy the finality of death itself. Yet we must also acknowledge that this entire cultural edifice was built upon a foundation of endless sickness and sorrow. The bioarchaeologist Bernardo Arriaza, who dedicated his life to this mystery, captured this dissonance perfectly, stating in his work that when faced with these remains, he felt a mix of admiration for their art and pity for their tragedy. Should we admire them or should we pity them? The answer is that we must do both. To only see the art is to sanitize their suffering. To only see the suffering is to deny their agency and their defiant creativity. The implications of this extend far beyond the coast of Chile. The Chinchorro are an anomaly, but the conditions they faced are not. They are a case study, preserved in the planet's dreariest desert, of a fundamental interaction that has shaped human history. The collision between a vulnerable human biology and a hostile, unseen environment. It compels us to ask a new set of questions when we look at the past. When we see the sudden emergence of a complex death cult, a new fertility goddess, or a ritual purification, should our first assumption be a shift in cosmology? Or should we look for the forgotten environmental trigger, the chronic illness, the micronutrient deficiency, the persistent local toxin, that created a social crisis so profound that the only solution was to rewrite the rules of reality? How much of the ancient world's rich tapestry of belief and ritual is in fact a public health record written in the language of myth? This perspective reframes our entire lineage. We are the descendants of the survivors. Our DNA and our cultures have been shaped by millennia of forgotten struggles against invisible enemies. The Chinchorro's tangible lineage was their unique solution, but the problem they faced is universal. Every culture is, in some sense, a system for managing suffering and codifying the lessons of survival. The story of the Chinchorro is not truly over because the questions it unearths are now our own. The past is not a static collection of facts. It is an active investigation, constantly reshaped by new tools and new paradigms that allow us to see what was previously invisible. Exploring these hidden forces that have driven our history is the central work of understanding who we are. We are left with the final, unavoidable question that their 7,000-year-old story demands we ask of ourselves. If one of humanity's most profound spiritual traditions was born not from divine inspiration, but from a desperate response to a poisoned environment, how many of our other foundational beliefs are simply the codified grief of our ancestors? The Chinchorro struggle with a poisoned environment is a chilling example of adaptation. But this is part of a larger pattern. In our next video, we reveal how a different pressure, The changing light of ancient Europe ignited a genetic revolution that repainted an entire continent. Subscribe to keep uncovering these hidden connections.